Welcome back. President-elect Donald Trump won the battleground of Georgia and its 16 electoral votes.
Some ballots are still being counted. However, 99% of jurisdictions in the state have reported, and the former president has a 2% lead.
Trump lost Georgia to President Biden by less than 1% in the 2020 presidential election. You might recall him pressuring the Republican Secretary of State to, quote, find those votes that he needed to win. In 2016, Trump defeated Hillary Clinton in Georgia with 51% of the vote.
CBS News congressional correspondent Nikole Killion joins us from Atlanta. Nikole, I'm sure you're doing what every reporter that we have fanned out across the country is doing today in figuring out what happened. From your reporting, what appears to have caused Georgia to flip back to Trump?
Well, look, I think a couple of things, right? You know, many argue that Georgia is a red state. Yes, President Biden flipped it back in 2020. Yes, Senators Ossoff and Warnock were elected here. But keep in mind, with President Biden's victory back in 2020, that was the first time a Democrat had flipped the state in some 30 years. So some of the thinking is that it was just flipping back to what it was. The other part of it is that a couple of different factors. You know, the former president kind of mended fences with Governor Brian Kemp, who was very successful back in 22, winning a second term to office. He has a very strong, robust campaign turnout operation that assisted with the Trump campaign and the state Republican Party to try to turn out votes. So that was another factor. And then, of course, just the dynamics on the ground. You know, what Trump campaign operatives told me is that, look, you know, they felt that their ground game here was underestimated. They held some 2,000 events here in Georgia in the last couple of months leading up to the election. They did a lot of focus, particularly on black voters, holding the most events for black voters out of any other battleground state. So there was a real emphasis on not only turning out the African-American population, trying to cut down some Democratic margins there, but also reaching out into some of these rural areas, trying to turn out some of these low propensity voters, which is a strategy that we saw across other battleground states as well.
And Nikole, Democrats have long focused on where you are in Atlanta, and your point is well taken, an important one, Georgia's place in terms of battleground states. We may need to reevaluate which states are battleground states entirely in our next election without Trump in it. But did all the big counties vote Republican in Georgia?
Well, as you well know, I mean, we're here in Fulton County, which is one of the most populous counties here in Georgia. So obviously, no, that did not go for Donald Trump. And typically, you know, many of these counties here around Metro Atlanta are more Democratic strongholds, as well as places like Savannah and Macon. But that being said, you know, again, the former president did cut into some of the margins here in Fulton County, DeKalb County, also kind of dug into some of the margins down around Macon and other parts of the state. But the real emphasis, again, was kind of on turning out that rural vote. You know, one thing that some Republican operatives told me is that this was really about the early vote turnout. They were already starting to see some strong numbers there, particularly around a lot of the counties, for instance, that are north of Atlanta, just kind of further outside of the metro area, bordering with Tennessee. That was something critical for them, but seeing that kind of higher, more robust Republican turnout in the early vote made them confident going into Election Day that they would ultimately have the votes to put them on the path to victory.
What were the key issues for voters?
Well, look, I think a lot of things. I mean, just in talking to voters, not only here in Georgia, but, you know, across the country, again, economy, is the economy stupid? I mean, that really was something you heard that was a through line through many of the voters we talked to throughout the course of this campaign. You know, the higher prices, inflation, you know, for groceries, for, you know, buying a home, you know, just everyday expenses was really a big concern among a lot of voters. Obviously, the border was also a critical issue, even in a state like Georgia, which isn't necessarily on the U.S.-Mexico border. So, you know, many people felt the impact of that, even if they weren't necessarily a border state. And I think another thing that stands out to me, particularly in talking to some voters in Georgia, you know, I remember we went to a rally maybe about a week or two ago, further outside of Atlanta in Gwinnett County, and there was a woman there who was very vocal, and she said, you know, we're part of the silent majority, but we're not going to be silent anymore. So again, I think some of those disaffected voters who felt that, over the last couple of years, their voices weren't being heard, felt that this time around they would, and they felt emboldened by the former president's candidacy.
Nikole Killion, thanks so much for joining us.